And I want to start with in a very basic place. I popped over to Merriam-Webster today to look up the definition of interview. And so much of what we've talked about in our discussions as a group and with other journalists is kind of the purpose, the place, and the relationship that exists when you are doing an interview. And in the very nuts and bolts sense, the Merriam-Webster definition is the straight example, literally saying what it is. But obviously, it extends far beyond that. So I was curious, as somebody who thinks about interviewing beyond just that, a meeting to get information, how do you see an interview? What is an interview to you?
That's an interesting question. I think that my perspective on it is informed by the fact that I am at best a pseudo journalist. So, my NPR show Bullseye with Jesse Thorn makes me an NPR journalist, and it's the reason that I can't talk about political candidates in public, or you know, donate to the ACLU or whatever. I'm bound by a journalistic code of ethics at NPR, but it's also a show that I've been doing since I was literally a teenager, in college at UC Santa Cruz. And, we started incorporating interviews into the show, frankly, because we didn't have enough time on a week to week basis to write an hour's worth of jokes. So, I have always approached it both in the practical or journalistic sense and as an entertainer. So my responsibility as an interviewer on Bullseye, which is an arts and culture interview show, is both to provide the audience with information that is useful to them or clarifying or tells a story in the way that like a newspaper journalist might be looking for, and to give the audience a fun way to pass 30 or 40 minutes, right? And so for me, I am always keeping in mind both of those goals. But in doing the turnaround, which was a podcast that I did about where I interviewed different interviewers about interviewing, um, it made me think about all of the different types of interviewing that exist in a way that I hadn't much in the past, right? Like I had to think about what Ira Glass needs to get out of an interview versus what Katie Couric needs to get. And they're completely different things, right? And in turn, they're completely different from, uh, from what Jerry Springer needs. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it's something that encompasses a lot of different stuff. For me, my ultimate goal is for the thing to be fun. And then beyond that, for you at least to leave not feeling dumber.
Do you remember your first interview?
I think the first one, I mean, there's like different milestones. I think the first one I ever did was there was a guy named Ariel at our college radio station, and he knew I had a cassette recorder, which was this is not that long ago. This was in the 21st century, but I had this cassette deck that was, this big, like the size of a turntable, that was a portable cassette deck that my mom had bought in the 70s, and that had a shoulder strap. And you carried it was like a VCR. If you imagine putting a VCR over your shoulder, and I had a microphone that I had bought at Radio Shack. And this guy Ariel said, "We have Black Alicious coming by, which is a rap group from the Bay Area, coming by the station, but the studio is booked. Can you come help me do the interview and record it?" And I'm quite sure that I did a terrible job. I can't. But then there are a few others. Like when we realized we could book interviews to fill time on our show, one of the first ones that I remember booking was Dick Dale, the king of the surf guitar. And what happened is my co-host Jordan went to dickdale.net, on the internet. And this was, 2000, maybe 2001. and there was just a phone number at the bottom, and he called it, and Dick Dale answered. And he was like, "Hey, will you come on our podcast on our college radio show?" And he said, "Yeah." And then he came on and he told us about all the different genres of music he invented. Apparently, Dick Dale invented all the genres of music, if you ask Dick Dale. And then, some of them are like, what was the first time we felt like we really got something special, or like made a real connection with a guest? Matt Besser and Matt Walsh of the Upright Citizens Brigade were big early ones for us. We really admired them. And some of the first were some of the times it really went badly. Um, we booked we booked Screech from Saved by the Bell, Dustin Diamond, may he rest in peace. And it turns out that the reason he went to jail and all that other stuff was because he's a jerk. Was a jerk. Again, may he rest in peace. He told a bunch of really off-color street jokes about disabled people. And he was coming through town to play a stand-up club in Santa Cruz. And we said, "Hey, maybe we should talk about your act." And I'll never forget, he said, "This is my act." We were like, "Ooh." Or Steve from Blues Clues, who wouldn't talk about Blues Clues. Would not talk about that. Was the rule for Steve from Blues Clues. Would not talk about Blues Clues. He made a very nice record with the guy who produced those great Flaming Lips albums. Very pretty. Sounds like a second-rate Flaming Lips album. But he would talk about that, but not anything about Blues Clues. So yeah, I mean, it's all these, and then like life-changing ones. I mean, like me talking to Bill Withers the first time. I mean, you can see behind my shoulder is Bill Withers, actually. Was genuinely, sincerely life-changing. I mean, one of the things about that drew me into this is I wanted to talk to people that I admired and find out how they did it and why they did it. Because I am a creative person as well. And part of it was simply me having started doing this as a 19-year-old, just trying to figure out who I was in the world.
How long did it take you before you felt like that muscle memory was kicking in? That those early challenges that you were experiencing maybe just became part of the process that you could brush off, or you just felt yourself maybe getting a little bit better at it?
Yeah, in the early days, I had two co-hosts, Jordan and Gene, and we had a system whereby when one of us had a question, we would raise our hand in the studio, because this was Santa Cruz and no entertainer ever came to Santa Cruz. So, except for Dustin Diamond. And so like the guest was never in the studio. They were always in the phone. So we would, raise our hand when we had a question. And because I was the sort of anchor host, it was always my job to ask a question when no one was raising their hand. And that was really hard at first. I was really grateful to have two other people in there to, if someone was winding down and I didn't have anything to say, to go, anybody else? But it got easier over time. I mean, I would frankly say that it didn't feel like something I felt like I was good at it, but it didn't feel like something that came naturally or that I didn't have to sort of muscle through until two things. One, I went on tour doing Bullseye. And, touring is really hard even when you have an act, because the traveling is hard and so on and so forth. But when you don't have an act, when the show is completely different at every stop, and you are the responsible person on stage, it is an absolute nightmare, right? So doing Bullseye, we would have some comics and musicians on the show to perform, but the main bulk of the show would be me doing interviews. And I was on an airplane or in a car all day. I didn't have internet. I can't read in the car. It makes me barfy. So like I had this window to prepare for the interviews that was essentially an hour, like between sound check and curtain. And I just said to my producers, I had always done all my own prep, but I said, just print out a dossier for each guest, order it most interesting to least interesting. Like just print out start with the New Yorker article and end with USA Today. And and I'll just do as much as I can and then go on stage and see what happens. And in doing that, what I found was that, I'm sure there were missed opportunities, and I'm sure that if I had all of the time in the world, it could have been better. But what I found was that the result was, as much as it was cramped by the fact that I didn't know every single thing, it was um, improved by the fact that I was more present and more spontaneous and listening better and following up better. And when I did the turnaround, I had no, I was going to say no plan to make any money from it, but realistically, no avenue to make any money from it. I could not figure out how to make any money from it. But I thought it would be cool. And so, my producers were two of our production fellows at Max Fun, which is basically, it's like paid interns. So it was, they were learning as they were going. So I couldn't lean on them for much. And I wasn't getting paid, and I have a lot of other jobs. So I just said, look, the rules for this are, I really care about interviewing, and I know these people. I know who Larry King is. So I'm just going to let myself off the hook. And if I have some time for preparation, I'll prepare. And if I don't, I won't. And both in the process of doing that, which forced me to be, again, I wouldn't recommend that as a general practice, but in the process of doing that, it forced me to be present and spontaneous in a way that I wouldn't otherwise be, to be myself in a way that I wouldn't otherwise be, to feel my feelings and have my natural reactions and so on and so forth. And then practically, I mentioned Larry King, but I interviewed some people who were really heroes of mine, like Ira, Terry Gross, Brooke Gladstone from On the Media. These are people that I really truly admired. And then I interviewed people that I just thought, well, they probably have something interesting to say, like Jerry Springer, right? Turns out Jerry Springer does not know the topic of his show until he walks on stage in front of the audience and reads it from the cue card. That's what I learned from Jerry Springer. But with Larry King, I went to his house. We were surprised that he said yes. We went to his house in Beverly Hills. It was like a total like Cribs house, like both completely ridiculous and profoundly generic, like that kind of like white grand piano house. And like I was ushered by his assistant through his grand entry hall and into his study, which was a trophy room. It had walls completely covered in pictures of him with baseball Hall of Famers and presidents and awards from the ALS Society of Syracuse, New York, and stuff. And I was like, this is going to be horrible. This is going to be such a disaster. I was like, why did I book Larry King on this? Oh, Larry King is maybe famous for being a bad interviewer. What am I gonna like? What am I gonna learn from this crazy Beverly Hills man who's 90? And the second he walked in the room, he was the most compelling person I've ever talked to in my life, with the possible exception of he's on a very short list that maybe just him and RuPaul. And he was so immediately present with me. And he said to me at one point that his idea of the best question he'd ever asked was, he asked a pilot, like an airline pilot, when he took off, did he always know he was going to be able to land? And I realized that what was amazing about Larry King was that Larry King did not give a shit. Larry King was a sincerely, intensely curious person who was entirely unafraid of looking like a dumbbell. And that's why many people believed him to be a dumbbell, despite the fact that I could tell from talking to him that he was not. Um, and I found that experience shockingly transformative in a way that I didn't find the experience of talking to my hero, Terry Gross, transformative, although it was certainly exciting to talk to Terry Gross. Um, because it drove home to me how important it was as a host and as an interviewer to be authentic and authentically curious. Um, and like when I talked to Ira Glass, you know, I I realized, oh, what makes him special is not some special technique. You know what I mean? It was not some secret power move. It's that Ira really cares what other people have to say. And specifically, Ira really cares how other people feel. That's why his show is about feelings. he he the second you sit down with him, he is trying to ask you about your feelings. Like I had that experience on the turnaround. Like I kind of knew him, but not well. And I'm like interviewing him. I'm like one question in, and he's asking me questions about my feelings. And I had to be like, Ira, shut up. Shut up, Ira. I'm asking you about you. So it was that experience of going into that situation without any preconceived notions about these people, other than that I admired them and they were in the same line of business as me, and maybe I could learn something from them, that drove home to me both in theory and in praxis uh, the significance of being sincerely curious, being present, and being authentically yourself in a in a generous way, but really yourself.
You know, when your prep work varies like that, one of the things that always strikes me listening to you guide interviews as well as others, the the kind of knowledge metabolism is so fast. So maybe your prep work wasn't done that day, but as a generalist, your prep work in life is putting you in that position to excel. Is there something that you're doing just in the normal course of life that you feel like is helping you stay on your toes in a way that, reading notes an hour before an interview might not?
I mean, my show, I pick what goes on it. And that's a big help because generally speaking, outside of rock and roll stuff, uh, it's stuff that I is already in my wheelhouse. God bless rock and roll stuff. I have a sense of what uh, of what white people I know like, but it is not my area of expertise. um so like when it comes to film or comedy or hip hop or these other things that we cover on the show, those are all coming directly from my own interests and tastes. So typically I am approaching it with expertise that is born of years of whatever you want to call it, cultural criticism, connoisseurship, whatever. So that helps. Um, but in general, I think it is the accretion of having done it 20 bajillion times, then the willingness to, both in preparation and in conversation, actively look for something interesting. And I did in my younger days, I did a fair amount of improv. God forgive me. And there's this idea in improv, which is when you're building a scene. This is especially true in long form improv. When you're building a scene, you look for the first. There's a term of art for it that I don't remember, but you look for the first distinctive element, right? So when you're on stage and your suggestion is ships, and somebody is the bosun and somebody is the captain, and they're just talking about knots or whatever, and somebody says, and the bosun says, I don't know how we're going to keep all these bananas fresh. you know the banana, like the improviser on stage has to be like, Bananas? Okay, I guess it's a banana ship. Let's talk about that. You know what I mean? It goes immediately from being a generic um, pile of pablum, just talking about boat stuff, to, oh, banana ship. Like, let's get into it, right? And in conversation, in an interview, it is the same thing, and in preparing for an interview as well. Like, what I am looking for is things that spark my interest and curiosity, that surprise me. And so, when I'm talking to Big Boy from Outcast, and he is making the point that, maybe I have read elsewhere that, Big Boy was a really good student in high school and Andre was a bad student, and Big Boy was the artsy one and Andre was the preppy one. Um, when Big Boy says, yeah, we used to make our own clothes. We used to get clothes cheap and then bleach them and dye them. I hear that and I'm like, this is a specific I need to investigate. Like, and you don't have to like have a great question in that moment. What I said to Big Boy was, hold on, like with RIT dye, which is the kind of dye you buy at the grocery store, right? And Big Boy goes, what you know about that RIT dye? And he starts talking about this outfit that he dyed. He dyed pink and purple, called his Raspberry Surprise. And you're like, I've just made the interview by noticing that he said dye my own clothes, right? Like, I could have left it with generic stuff, but recognizing a specific, like, going for the detail, finding something that is particular in that is always going to make it better. Like, Ira actually, uh, with this woman who's a comics artist named Jessica Abel, made a comic book of This American Life many years ago. I mean, 20 years ago. But you can still buy it from their website. It costs $2 for the PDF, I believe, $5 for the comic book. And there's this thing that's like, I think it's Alex Chadwick from NPR legend Alex Chadwick who says this, but I might be wrong. It might be Scott Simon. Anyway, this is generic question you can always use, which is, what did you think it was going to be like? What did it turn out to be like? And how would you compare the two? Which Ira announces is a perfect question because it automatically contains two stories and a reflection and synthesis. And you can literally, I mean, you truly can ask that question about anything. You 100% you could ask that about beers. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. But it is that sense of like taking the vague and turning it into the concrete, taking the diffuse and turning it into the narrative, turning it into the expository, turning it into an argument. Those are things that people can wrap their heads around, and to do that you just have to notice. You just have to be there to notice, and that can happen in prep as well as it can happen on mic or with a pen and pad in your hand.
If there's this overlap where it's the genuine curiosity, which could be much of the same as just not being afraid to look dumb, because honestly that's just functioning in the world, right? That's the honest way that you can approach an interview. But the challenge is that can even be that can be a surprising thing, because as if I'm setting up an interview, or if Kate or Beth on the call here are setting up an interview, there's this expectation that they're going to know how to guide this, or they know what they're looking for. But to me, it sounds like when you talk about that genuine curiosity, that kind of brings it back almost to the search for entertainment and information in one package, because your passion and genuine interest shows through, but you're still looking for that information as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some great and some very bad experiences as an interviewee that I think about sometimes. And the the main area of expertise that I have, that people would interview me as an expert, is menswear. in addition to all those many credits that you listed, I also have a menswear website. And menswear is as specific and nuanced and uh, connoisseur driven as I'm sure the world of beer is, right? And when I'm interviewed as an expert, I've had experiences where, the best you can hope for is, generally speaking, is that a women's wear expert is interviewing you, like a women's wear journalist, like a fashion journalist. But generally, it's going to be a like general assignment style journalist. And this happened to me at the New York Times one time. A reporter from the New York Times emailed me, said, "I want to get your opinion about puffy vests." This is true. I know this sounds like a ridiculous nonsense example, but literally someone from the New York Times emailed me about puffy vests. And they said, "We noticed puffy vests are coming back in. What do you think about it?" And I said various stellar insights about puffy vests. And they emailed me back and said, "Well, don't you think it's like this?" And I said, "Well, I kind of think I don't know if you noticed these great insights that I offered you before, but you asked me these questions. I gave some really great answers. These are my thoughts about that." And they said, "Are you sure? I'd love to quote you in this story." And I was like, "Oh, you wrote this story. You have a paragraph written with quotation marks around it. You just need a name to attach at the end of it." Right? But like in general, the best experiences like that, and I'm sure that all of you have had an experience dealing with, a general assignment newspaper reporter or something in your own life, whether it was about an area of expertise that you have, or just, something that happened, your neighbor turned out to be a serial killer or whatever. um, there is that point where a good reporter sort of says back to you their understanding of what it is, and says, does all that make sense to you? Like, does any of that sound dumb? And like when somebody's writing a podcasting story or a menswear story or something like that, and they email me, even if they just want to say like, "Hey, I've got some stuff. I just want to make sure that it's right, that it's not wrong." That kind of humility to be able to, because otherwise what often ends up happening, and it ends up happening in huge outlets, especially ones with quick turnarounds and not a lot of editors, and is that, when somebody in general interest media writes about or talks about a thing that you actually know about, you're like, wow, they really misrepresented that. And it is really hurtful. And if you can imagine, I mean, if you can imagine if, that area of expertise is, for example, an identity category, you can see why people completely distrust the media, right? It's like, why does this person get to tell my story if they can't even be bothered to say it back to me and say, does that sound about right? And that doesn't mean, obviously, having sources write your story for you, or feeling like you need to get approval of your sources to write a story. But what it is the humility to say that if you're a journalist, it's your job to gather information. It's your job to be a conduit of expertise and truth to your audience, and part of that is the humility of being able to run it by a few people, or to ask, maybe this is dumb, but and have the person answer, because often maybe this is dumb, but questions are like Larry King asking the pilot whether he always knows that he's going to be able to land the plane after it takes off. And what you hear is, you know, all the things a pilot is scared of, and what could be more compelling than hearing all the things that pilot is scared of, like my, my kids, my kid's best buddy's mom is a pilot for Alaska. And like, she's the most like charismatic, competent human being you could ever meet. And you're like, she's like exactly what you imagine, just like with the pilot hat on. And like, she was in the Air Force and stuff. And like, of course it's fascinating to hear what she's scared of, you know? So having that humility is so important.
What do you think about puffy vests?
They really wanted to connect it to like Back to the Future, and I was trying to connect it to this was 10 years ago, so I was trying to connect it to like Heritage Americana.
Mm.
And God, they just really had it. They had 80s, they had like 80s revival written into this narrative. And I was like, this is much more about like a revival of like 70s mountaineering aesthetics than it is about Michael J. Fox. Yeah, that actually genuinely pissed me off when that happened. I was like, I know the New York Times style section can be garbage from time to time. Sometimes it's just I've seen two people in Brooklyn do this, but I was, even in that context, I was disappointed.
There is an
New
entry.
York Times subscriber, by the way. Sorry, Brian. I just want to make it clear. New York Times subscriber. I pay for it. Wonderful newspaper, etc.
Avoid the puffy vest contents
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
2021.
Yeah.
One of the things I think I appreciate, which I hear from you and I hear from other skilled interviewers, is exactly what you're talking about, where it's not just repeating back what you've heard, but it's also taking that opportunity to, whether it's intentional or not, offer up some kind of personal, very brief anecdote, or just state something clearly that here's what I hear you saying. Here's something that I connect to it as well, followed by question, non sequitur or not. And I listened to Wright Thompson talk about this recently, where he was talking about the way that he likes to try to engage to get subjects to maybe dig a little deeper personally is he'll share what he thinks is their intended statement. So, I hear you talking about uh, the new baseball season. And I remember, when I was a kid, these are the feelings I had in my connection in the beginning of every baseball season. And it sounds like you have that kind of reaction too. Is that right? The benefit there being, I guess, is that if you're wrong, they can move on and you can go to the next question. If they're right, then all of a sudden you have this kind of nugget that you can kind of chip away at a little bit, something that maybe helps further it just a tiny bit more.
I think really central is that it'd be a question, right? So you can ask almost any question in an interview context. It is appropriate to do so, right? Like, um, I interview figures from all arts and cultures. So in some cases, I will offer them what in my mind is the Terry Gross proviso, which is you're an artist and you're allowed to keep whatever of your personal life personal that you want. That doesn't belong to us. So if I ask something that is personal that you don't want to talk about, that's okay. Just let me know. This interview is not live. But even that honestly just gives you permission to ask more personal stuff. And so I think when you are interviewing, if you are actually asking a question rather than making an assertion, it's fine. And you can make an assertion as part of the question. You can say, do you mean to say that this? Right? You can also share, something that Ira does sometimes is share a little bit about himself. To show that it doesn't have to be a one-way street. I mean, Ira wouldn't, Ira is naturally a person who, when you're talking to him, you feel like there's no one else in the world but you. But, he's not afraid to show his own vulnerability, right? I feel like you can ask anything as long as it's a question. And the worst thing that can happen is they can say, I'd rather not talk about that. And then, you can decide based on the subject matter, whether that's okay. I mean, in general, for me, it is, but I also like, here's some hot goss if you guys are interested. But my producer, Kevin, is a huge fan of this British sitcom called Peep Show. Really great show. It's like his favorite show. It's Beth's favorite show too. And well, bad news coming in from the West, Beth. and it's created by or co-created by these and stars these two guys called Mitchell and Webb, British comedy team, and they have a show that's entering its second season on IFC, and so we booked them on the show on that basis. And one of them, David Mitchell, had been on my show years ago and was really wonderful, and so I was really looking forward to it. And the morning of, I, as I occasionally do, I just like tweeted like, "Hey, so and so's coming on my show. What should I ask him about?" Which, frankly, is mostly just a way for me to get people engaged with the idea that my show exists. Especially like people who know me from my comedy work and not from my NPR interview show, and so they don't know that maybe Mitchell and Webb are the kind of thing I interview on NPR. Um, and a couple people said, "Man, you should ask Robert Webb about being a TERF." And a TERF, if you don't know, is a term of art for a trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is a broad category of people who basically think that trans people in general and trans women specifically are out to invade women's spaces, and it's really gross and awful. And very big movement in the UK, unfortunately. And I was like, oh no, I'll look into this. I hope this is not the case. And I looked into it and I was like, kind of seems like maybe it is, but it was a couple years ago and it's not really clear. And so I talked about their great sketch from their sketch comedy show called Number Wang that everyone should watch and enjoy because it's one of the greatest things ever, for the first 45 minutes of the conversation. And then I said, Robert, I have to ask you about something pretty difficult, in 2018, blah, 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 right? And at one point in the ensuing conversation, he said, this is something I would just rather not talk about. And so I asked him another question about it, because it seemed important and newsworthy to me. And my show's not usually about making news and, whatever, but I also would like to think that, if I had somebody on the show who said plantations weren't that bad, that I would ask them about that too, and it was very unpleasant. I hated it the entire time. That is not who I am. I am an ingratiating glad-hander. But it was important, so I did it. And, they tried to, IFC was surprised for some reason, and they tried to get us to retape that part. And I was like, guys, we all knew we were recording, guys. There are times for that. But, I also, after that happened, I called a friend who had interviewed my wife and I after our daughter came out as trans. And he's a trans man himself and has thought a lot about the intersection of journalism and gender identity. And after he was glad to learn that the reason I asked him to call me wasn't because I had said something dumb and needed him to rescue me from the trans community, but was rather that I had this situation with Robert Webb. He was like, listen, a public figure is a public figure. If this was, one of the 19-year-old trans men that I interview who have never been interviewed before, and they said something that was this stupid, but was not the subject of what I was writing about, of course I would protect that person, because that is part of the transaction there, is that I am an honest broker for them, right? I'm not there to make them look foolish, and the only value in making them look foolish is, baloney. But he said, with a public figure is a public figure, and they're responsible for the effects of their words, and they need to be held to account on that basis, right? So, he could have just never tweeted about it. So yeah, I mean, it's not always fun, but it is what it is.
What do you physically feel like in that moment when you realize that you're going to enter that space that is important but discomforting?
I felt sick. Yeah, I mean, I felt physically ill for sure. Um, I was very grateful I was not in the same room, but I could see his face. I mean, I could see David Mitchell's face. We were on Zoom. Like, I could see poor David Mitchell like, oh no, my friend from college. Fuck, 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 fuck. You know, you could just see it passing across his visage. Um, but yeah, I felt horrible. And, you know, in that situation, I knew, you know, I'm not, I'm not Michelle Martin or Scott Simon or Tom Brokaw, or like, this isn't what I do every day. I don't like, I was terrified to do it, you know? It's not, it's like speaking truth to power is not my main thing I do. Um, and so I like that morning, I was like, I said to my producer, Kevin, I need some help because I'm very close to this because my kid is trans. So I need some help. Help me find a couple things to say and the right way to say them. I will say them like a person and look at them beforehand and, you know, edit them from my perspective as the parent of a trans kid. And then I will have some framework. And I knew I had that. And I knew I didn't have to be a dick about it because, you know, it was his thing. You know, he had I was giving him an opportunity, you know, like in a way I thought of it the same way that I thought of, you know, the first time Ira was on my show, Ira Glass was on my show many, many years ago when I was, you know, a 26-year-old or whatever. And he was my total hero and is. Ira is not a turf as far as I know. But the first time Ira was on my show, I asked him a question about narrative bias in journalism because I had a friend who was the subject of a This American Life story that, for the purposes of narrative, had no lies in it, but privileged narrative over fact, let's say, left a lot of stuff out that would have made him look a lot better and made him into a villain. And he got death threats by email for like 2 months afterwards. And this was for, he invented this thing called improv everywhere, the goal of which is to do goofy, fun stuff in public. Like they're the people that all froze in Grand Central Station, right? And I knew I had this specific example, and I wanted to ask Ira about it. And the reason I asked Ira about it was because I know that Ira is no turkey, and he has thought about this. This is his job. It's his entire life. You know, if he doesn't have an answer for this question, then what is he doing here? You know, like that's like a major problem if he's never considered this. You know, if he hasn't decided, weighed it out for himself. And like he's a good dude, so he probably has a good answer. And he did have a good answer. I mean, it was one that I maybe disagreed with a little bit, but like it helped me understand him and where he was coming from. And he's just, you know, the reason he was on the show is because he's smart and successful, and his smart success stuff made him good at answering that question. And with this tough interview question, it was kind of the same deal. It was, what I am doing is giving him an opportunity to explain himself. And I'm not going to take all from him. I guess I just said fuck, fuck, fuck a second ago. So I'll say I'm not going to take any bullshit from him, but I'm giving him an opportunity. I'm opening something for him. I'm not making him look bad. It's his words. He has the chance to speak for himself. And I'm giving it to him. So I tried to comfort myself with that. But, you know, I felt horrible. I got a migraine. I mean, it sucked. And that was me literally being righteous on behalf of my child. You know what I mean? Like, it was it was tough. It's hard.
Beth wanted to know if you felt that the best interviewers are extroverts, or are they introverts who just know the right questions to ask?
I think that most performers I have met are introverts of any kind. Yeah. I mean, it's that thing of like I'm friends with a lot of stand-ups, and like with stand-ups, they're all, first of all, you think that they'd be like at a party like holding court, but actually they're like trying to sneak around and hide, right? Like I'm friends with famous interviewer and stand-up Mark Maron, and like Mark once told me that he loves to cook at parties because it's the only way to be the center of attention without talking to anyone. um, and I think generally speaking, that is true. I think the one non-negotiable thing is to actually be sincerely curious about others. Um, I think whether that person is an introvert or an extrovert, you know, uh, it can be one or the other, or a mix of both. I think myself, um, I'm certainly a mix of both. And, I think I'm probably more of an introvert. I'm mostly an only child, and I still can't believe that my children want to do anything other than sit in their room and read. Um, but, like a lot of introverts, I like to have special contexts with rules and special situations where I can really enjoy the interaction time when I've recharged in my private time. I mean, think of stand-ups, right? Like all these introvert stand-ups, like the reason they got into stand-up is because when you're doing stand-up, like exactly what the rules are. Like either they're laughing or they're not laughing. Like anytime you hear one of those Jerry Seinfeld type comedians get grumpy about political correctness and blah 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 blah, what they're complaining about is not anything political or whatever. They're just complaining that they thought they knew the rules and then found out that they didn't. They're like, no, the whole reason I started doing this was because it was a binary. I was doing good if they were laughing and not if they were not. Yeah.
So you know the rules, you engage with the rules during when you're interviewing. But
Yeah.
what is your relationship to asking questions the rest of your day?
I'm not like a person that talks to people that are sitting next to me on the airplane. Some people who have this job and are good at it are just like that. I don't know. Like Ira, for example, I don't know if he's an introvert or an extrovert, but I can tell you that I believe in my heart that, you say one interesting thing to Ira Glass, and 90 minutes later, you've told him about the like most traumatic experiences of your life and your life's greatest successes, because he's like a black hole sucking in feelings. um, but it's for real, right? I mean, I think there are also people on TV who are more interested in performing than they are in listening or learning. But like I also don't think that's like makes you a bad person, right? Like I'm sure I'm going to use this example just because I know he's a listener to Judge John Hodgman, one of my shows, so I feel like I could make fun of him. But like I feel like probably and he's always been really nice to us and filled in for me one time. But like I feel like Jake Tapper goes home and like corrects his mirror. Like he's like, actually, mirror, oh, you're burnt. Like here's the facts, mirror. And that's a thing too. Takes all kinds.
Gail had a question. She was curious, what's the most surprising or illuminating thing that you've learned from interviewing?
I mean, very broadly, I think that um, I grew up with divorced parents who both had major emotional issues. Well, one had, one has, one's dead. Um, and both wonderful, loving parents, but like profoundly unpredictable. And I grew up mostly as an only child. I have two much younger half brothers. And for that reason, my way of being in the world by default is to take responsibility for myself. And, I do that too. I was taking the city bus to school by myself when I was in second grade. But I'm good at taking responsibility for myself. I built a company and, whatever. But the withdrawal and reserve that way of being in the world engenders is not a productive way to live, especially not a productive way to live with people you love, and when you have, and doubly especially when you have kids, which I do. And so I think that being an interviewer has encouraged me to be comfortable sitting with other people and connecting with other people and not intellectualizing my relationship with other people in the way that I might naturally do. Um, in terms of like experiences I've had, like concrete experiences I've had while being an interviewer, I mean, Bill Withers comes to mind because, the first time I interviewed him, he had basically not done an interview in 20 years. And I don't know how he ended up doing publicity for this documentary he was in, but the people didn't know that they didn't know what they had. That's the only reason I got in there. I was in there and the people following me were Pasadena magazine. So I don't think they realized they could have got him like the cover of Spin or whatever. Bill Withers' first interview in 25 years. But he really gave me the business. And I hung tight. And I came out of that experience feeling like I was a worthy and competent person, because he had not been trying to ingratiate himself with me. He had nothing to sell. And he was pissed about a lot of things that had happened in his life, very reasonably. Not things that I personally had done, but like, he grew up in a coal mining town, in West Virginia during Jim Crow, So, and, he was in the music business, which is not the kindest. And, he was pissed about things quite righteously. And so the fact that I went through that experience and emerged from it feeling like I had been real with him and that he respected me and valued the time that we spent together, like, and in fact, like, the reason I put this, so I don't usually ask for autographs at the end of interviews, but in fact, I've done it, I think twice, You know, like I interviewed John Cleese. I didn't even have him sign my book, but with Bill Withers, it's like my favorite musician of all time. So I had him sign this record, and he signed it. And you know, Bill Withers is really straight. He's really plain. You know, like Bill Withers doesn't mess around. It's not. There wasn't any baloney when he was around, and he signed it. Jesse, thanks for your time and thanks for listening. And I knew from the experience of having talked to him that he was serious about that, like that it wasn't just pablum that he was giving me. And the thought that I had given him something, when I thought of myself as purely a leech on society, the thought that I had stayed with him, that I actually did, like, I wanted to hear what he had to say. Actually, like, it wasn't that I was there to do my job and I would be grateful to get out of there. I was there because I wanted to hear him. And almost everyone wants to be heard, you know? Even, you know, that's why people talk to that's why Prince what's his name and Meghan Markle talk to Oprah, right? It's not because they have something to gain from it. They're rich beyond, they could go live in a bubble under the ocean if they want to. You know what I mean? Like with just the 12 movie stars that they choose. But ultimately, like, they've been through stuff because they're human beings like all of us are, and they want to be heard, right? And so the idea, after I talked to Bill Withers, and it was so hard, and he really gave me the business, but then he laughed and thought I was funny, that I had given him something when he had given me what I felt like was so much, was a very transformative experience in terms of my work, because I think, honestly, I did not identify myself as an interviewer. I didn't identify myself as a journalist. I thought of myself as an artist or a creator. And I thought that this interviewing thing, despite being the main way I spent my time, was like a weird sideline that I happened to be good at, right? Like, I was like, well, I guess I have my own national public radio show. It's really getting in the way of my improv. And the idea that I might be actually offering something to these people and not just taking from them was pretty transformative for me. Kate asked in the chat who the other one was. It was Ishmael Butler from Diggable Planets, who later had so this album, Blowout Comb, was like you know how you like in Freaks and Geeks or something, they're just like a montage of an adolescent boy listening to Stairway to Heaven over and over and over or something. I think it's Jason Segel playing drums to The Who in Freaks and Geeks specifically, but like that thing where it's like completely transformative. For my wife, it was 100% listening to this one Ani DeFranco album over and over. I knew her at the time. But for me, it was this record. Like when I was 13, 14, 15 years old, I listened to it over and over and over and over and over. And when I had him on my show, I said that to him at the end. I mean, I had said it to very few other people. I said it to Paul Rubens about Pee Wee Herman. I said it to David Letterman after I talked to him. I had to ask him hard questions too. Anyway, Ish had signed my record, and then he has a group called Shabazz Palaces, and they performed with Judge John Hodgman when we did a show in Seattle where they live. And he came over and said, "Thanks for having us on your show." And I was like, "Thanks for meeting my gaze. Like, who am I?" And I was like, not only am I doing a show with this person, he's on my show. And then he offered to get me high, and I declined. And it was because I would have done a bad job in the show, but I should have said yes, just so I would have had done that. But it's okay.
I want to be mindful of your time. Can I ask you one more question?
Of course. Yeah, I'm fine. Don't worry about me.
because I want to go back to that moment when you're reflecting about talking with Bill Withers. That I would ask you what's the most important question you asked in that interview, but it sounds like instead it should be what's the most important time you listened instead of asking something.
I don't know. I mean, the one thing I remember is saying to him, it's one thing to leave the record business, but why don't you perform? Because he basically, his last hit was just the two of us with Grover Washington in 1981 or 1982, something like that. And he has not put out a record since, or he's passed away recently, but he did not put out a record the rest of his life. He wrote a couple songs for his friends with George Benson and Jimmy Buffett. So like they each have like one Bill Withers song on like an album of theirs from 2004 or whatever. But besides that, he didn't do anything in the music industry at all. He didn't even perform when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's like, why would I perform when Stevie Wonder's there? And I asked him, why don't you just do a show? And he said, I'm not an organ grinder's monkey and I don't need to dance. And I think me talking to him about what it would mean to me to see him perform in a way that was for real, not florid or anything, but just plain, like just me saying to him, I was born the year you quit the music business. I would love to see and do an acoustic set at the Largo, like you don't need to have a band. You still sing, at the house or whatever. And me kind of showing what that meant, what that would mean to me, led him to show me his heart about why he wasn't doing it. And, the reason he wasn't doing it is because he had been hurt in a way that was so deep, in a way that extended far beyond his own lifetime, even. He had been hurt as as a Black person in America, like the way that the record industry betrayed him was not simply the record industry betraying him. It was the record industry betraying his parents and his parents' parents and his parents' parents' parents. And that was very, very clear, that he felt there was no place in the world for somebody like him that looked like him, right? And that's a lot more than just those coke sniffing record executives wanted me to cover In the Ghetto by Elvis Presley, which is also one of the circumstances of why he quit the business, right? Not that those two don't tie together, but like me showing a little bit of my heart in a non-phony way led him to show his heart in a way that I found very deeply moving. Did that answer the question? I started talking about that time that I talked to my hero and I got distracted.
Yeah. Yes, it did. And I appreciate you sharing the stories and sharing all of this. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but how did you expect this conversation to go and how do you think it went?
I thought there would be a lot more discussion of flavor notes and quaffing. I don't know what quaffing is exactly, but I feel like probably there's a lot of, quaffing, possibly some gargling. I don't know. It seems like that would be problematic with a carbonated beverage, but I like the dawn of beer is performatively gargling here. It's got to be a real problem in the beer journalism community, performative gargling. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like, for me, I think the fundamental story that I always want to tell interviewing tips and tricks. And those do kind of exist. But what it ultimately turns out to be, is the story of a guy who thought he was, and to some extent still is, a professional comedian or aspiring professional comedian, like someone who aspired to be an artist, and thought of journalism as telling other people's stories. And shouldn't I just make my own stories? Um, Realizing that this job was something more than just, it's something more than just taking. I think in my heart, I felt like I was taking something from people when in fact I was giving something to people. And I thought that I was being at best a pipe or a tube through which other people flew, when in fact I realized that I was engaging in an act of creation myself. And you know I'm also glad to do tips and tricks. If you guys just want to do tips and tricks, that is also fine. If you want to know that you can stay quiet for way longer than you think you can stay quiet, and every time the person on the other end will fill in with something interesting and vulnerable because they're scared of the quiet, there's a tip and a trick for you. That's a really solid one. Just shut your yap and wait for them to say something. um, so you got that one. You got the question that works in every situation. Hopefully those will paper over the excess of existentialism that was the rest of this hour.
Well, thank you for the pro tips, Jesse. Thank you for the time.
I'm glad.
Yes, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining. Have a good night.
Thanks everyone.